Hello, nerds. Welcome to the History Nerds United podcast. Thank you so much for being here. On today's episode, we have author Catherine Grace Katz. It's a big deal, everybody. Let me explain this to you, all right? This is her first book. It's called Daughters of Yalta. It's a lot about the Yalta Conference right at the end of World War II. It's actually focused on the daughters of some of the leaders of the book. I'm not going to go too far into it because Catherine does. Why is this a huge deal? Catherine wrote this while getting her JD from Harvard Law. She might not be done just yet, but she's getting there, which she made me feel very lazy this entire episode because I don't know when or if she sleeps, but she's got degrees from everywhere. She's extremely intelligent, very passionate about the subject and basically everything around this. She also has some very controversial thoughts on baseball. Not going to ruin it for you, but listen for it. You're going to hear it. It's going to be a big deal. Love this episode. Had a really great time with Catherine. Not going to belabor the point. Let's get to the episode. But one programming note before we do. If you are an original history nerd, somebody who has been on the blog, has been listening to the podcast from day one, do me a favor. Email me, brendan@historynerdsunited.com. We may want to kind of give you a present. We don't know what that present is yet, but we want to know who our original nerds are so that we can reward you for helping make this possible. Brendan@historynerdsunited.com. Please email me. Let me know who you are. Love to talk to you. Gonna shut up. Let's get to Catherine. Let's do this, nerds. Catherine Grace Katz, welcome to the podcast. Thank you so much for being here.
Thanks so much for having me. I'm so excited to be here.
Your book, The Daughters of Yalta, is doing amazing, but in doing my research, I'm just going to say it, you made me feel very lazy because while you were writing this, were you also in law school? I forget what the name of the law school is. I think it starts with an H.
Yes, guilty.
So you were in Harvard Law School, and you wrote this book.
Yes.
All right, so the two questions are basically, do you have the most amazing time management skills that we've ever heard of, or do you just not sleep? How do you get that done?
Probably a little bit of both. One of my friends said that I had to be a shark, because sharks they keep moving while they're sleeping. And so I must also be a shark and keep moving while I'm sleeping. I don't know if that's quite true. I probably don't sleep enough, but I think I learned time management at an early age. I went to a high school called New Trier High School, just north of Chicago, and it's just notorious for being so much all the time. And so I had to learn really great time management skills as a high school student, and I think that has served me really well going forward ever since. But beyond that, I'm probably just a little crazy and took on two huge things at once, sleeping a little bit more now than I was then. So hopefully I can keep that up.
Now, you have to keep everyone's hopes up, right? You're going to keep writing even when you're a big fancy pants lawyer, right?
Definitely.
Okay, just to make sure. I doing my research too, it actually became very interesting. You know, you graduate college, you're doing a lot of things, you start working, and then the book just kind of naturally came to you. Can you tell me the story about how this idea got in your head and how you decided you wanted to pursue this?
Well, I've always loved history from the time I was a little kid. I've been a history nerd at heart since I was tiny. My favorite movies growing up were movies like The Sound of Music and White Christmas and The Great Escape, all of which had great World War II themes. And my grandfather served as an officer in the Navy during World War II and grew up during the Great Depression in Montana. And I loved chasing him around at Thanksgiving with a legal pad, asking him questions about his time growing up and being in the war. And so I was kind of the family's self-appointed historian from the time I was in grade school. So I think it's not surprising that I became a history major. So I studied history at Harvard and then did a master's in history at Cambridge. And in both of those instances, Churchill was kind of a tangential part of the research that I was doing. And so I ended up learning a good bit about him, but actually not Churchill during World War II. And the reason that the book came about most directly was because I had taken a step away from history when I was done with my master's and went to New York and started working in finance like every other recent grad in the world. And by sheer coincidence or fate, in the lobby of my office was a bookstore called Chartwell Booksellers, which is named after Churchill's home. And I used to go in there all the time when I would just need a break from the Excel modeling. I wanted to reconnect with history. So I'd say I was going to get a coffee, but I'd really be going into the bookstore and got to know the owner pretty well. And we'd chat about Churchill and history more generally. And over time, he said, you should meet this group called the International Churchill Society, which is made up of scholars and academics, but also professionals of all different industries that want to encourage people to go into public service and study things like history, foreign relations, kind of in the spirit of Churchill and his leadership. And they were excited to have a younger person who was interested. So they invited me to come over to a dinner they were having with Madeleine Albright right across the street from my office. And I thought it would just be a great opportunity to hear from a Secretary of State that I'd long admired, and didn't realize that there I would end up meeting members of the Churchill family and other members of this organization. And shortly thereafter, they were opening the papers of Sarah Churchill, Winston Churchill's middle daughter, for the first time. Her papers were at Cambridge, where I had been doing my master's, and they asked if I'd be interested in writing an article about them for their magazine. Just kind of a one-off, fun little project that I thought would be a great way just to re-engage with history and do a little bit of writing.
It almost sought you out just from that story. There's a lot of things that had to line up to bring you to where you got.
Well, the other crazy thing was I'd kind of been having these little odd connections to Sarah Churchill, I guess, from the time I was a really little kid, because my family goes on vacation down to the cloister at Sea Island, Georgia every summer. And Sarah Churchill had actually eloped there and gotten married in 1949. And there's this beautiful picture of Sarah Churchill on her wedding day that I'd walked past every single summer since I was literally a year old. And I'd always wondered a little bit about her life. And here I had this opportunity to be the first person to see her papers, learn about her in her own words. And I was immediately so struck by not her career as an actress, which is what people know her for today. She starred in a movie with Fred Astaire in 1951 called Royal Wedding. But she'd had this incredible relationship with her father, which led to these fascinating opportunities during World War II, which very few people know about.
And you decided to focus specifically on the Yalta Conference towards the end of World War II, the big three get together of the Allies to kind of discuss this, and their daughters, Winston Churchill's daughter, as you're talking about, FDR's daughter, and Avril Harriman, who I bet a lot of people, unless you're a real history nerd, don't even know that name. But they go and their daughters come along. What made you decide that you were going to focus on this particular aspect? And then we know how you got as far as Sarah Churchill, how she got there, but then how did you decide to focus on those three daughters in this particular time frame?
I originally thought I was going to write a biography of Sarah Churchill. So after a while, this little niggle of an idea wouldn't leave me alone. Meanwhile, I'd started applying to law school because I knew I didn't want to be in finance forever. And I thought, maybe there is a story here writing a biography of Sarah Churchill. So I kind of started exploring that option and thought that her life would make a really compelling book. And I certainly still could. But the more I learned about her, I was especially fascinated by her work during the war, where she'd served in the women's branch of the Royal Air Force and accompanied her father first as his aide at the Tehran Conference in 1943, which was the first time Churchill, FDR, and Stalin all met together, and they laid the plans for D-Day. Inspired by this great work that she'd done as kind of a daughter diplomat for Winston, both FDR and Avril Harriman then decided to bring their daughters to Yalta to serve as their aides. And they both had unique relationships with their daughters that made them just these really ideal partners to serve as their aides at this monumental conference on the precipice between World War and Cold War. So for all three daughters, they had these long-standing, really fascinating relationships with their fathers that were in some ways very ahead of their time, that made them the ideal choice to serve as aide. And I just was so struck by the idea that these three young women who were all about my age had been there at this conference. And yet in all the time I'd studied Yalta in school, I had never realized that they were there. So through the Churchill family, I ended up meeting Kathleen Harriman's family, and they kind of led me to Anna Roosevelt's family. And so I was actually able to meet the children, grandchildren, nieces and nephews of these three incredible daughters, and also had access to these papers that no one had seen before. So it was this incredible coming together of brand new archival material and the memories of people alive today who knew and loved them more than anyone else. And it was one of those moments that made history suddenly feel very much alive and not so far away. And I knew that if I didn't write the book now, those memories would be lost and I would regret it. And so I decided to take a chance, and this is the result.
Was it a little risky with this pitch? Because it sounds like when you're writing a book, it's very easy to say, I'm doing another book on Churchill, I'm doing another book on FDR, where yours is a bit riskier because the daughters were not in a lot of the conference, right? They weren't in there where the big decisions were being made and the arguments were being had. They were there and very important, but they're also slightly tangential to the big decisions being made. Does that make it harder to pitch the book, or because it hadn't been done before, was it easier to sell somebody on it?
I think it was a little bit of a frame shift in the way that you think about these characters. So yes, there are, I think when Andrew Roberts published his single volume biography of Churchill, I believe he said his was a 1010th biography of Churchill that had ever been published. So here you do have actually a new angle on some of these, fascinating men from history that we do know a lot about from the eyes of their daughters, the relationships with their daughters, which really hasn't been known and explored as much, partly because the archival resources hadn't been there to tell the story before. But it's not really so much the story about what the daughters did at Yalta. This is not, if only we'd listened to these daughters, the Cold War never would have happened. That's not what this book is. At its heart, this story is a story about relationships between nations, of course, between leaders, but fundamentally a story about the relationships between some very special fathers and their special daughters and that bond that they shared. And so I tried to keep in my mind this word relationships at the heart of the story and everything that I was writing. And yes, it's unfolding against the backdrop of this monumental conference at the end of World War II with huge players like Stalin, but it's a story about family and the bonds of a family. And, for readers who may feel a little intimidated by the geopolitics, we all know what it's like to be someone's child, and many people know what it's like to be someone's parent. And those are relationships that we can all understand. And so I really wanted to bring this more human view of history and people that we sometimes forget about.
And unfortunately, the area around Yalta is back in the news to begin with Russia and the Ukraine and everything like that. So again, unfortunately, but it's funny how these things keep coming around. I would like to jump a little bit. I think you've actually already answered this question, but I still want to ask. If you were only allowed to do a biography of one of the daughters, I think we know the answer, but let's hear it. You can only do a biography of one daughter. Which one's it going to be?
Well, this is not a comment on which one I like the most or I think is most interesting, not my favorite. It's asking me to pick my favorite of these daughters would be like asking you to pick your favorite child, and no one could do that. But I think just because this journey really started with thinking about, writing a biography of Sarah Churchill, that she would probably be the one that I would write about. She had a really varied and fascinated life and career before, during, and after the war, and was involved in so many different things, from family conversations about politics to her career as a glamorous actress. And she was an artist and a writer and had many facets to her life. And so she just had this really compelling story from start to finish. Not that the other two daughters didn't, but just, kind of given that this started with her, she would probably be the one that I'd write a biography about.
It felt like she had the best relationship with her father kind of overall. I think Churchill is very interesting. And as you said, with this kind of paradigm shift where you're looking at it differently, he comes across as, just quite frankly, more of a father. Each daughter kind of got treated like, an attaché, another person in this conference. But it seemed like with Sarah and Winston, he was still a dad in certain portions of that. Would you agree with that?
I completely agree. Sarah and Winston had a really warm relationship. He was a very emotional father, in some ways more emotionally engaged with his children when they were young than their mother, Clementine, who had a very good relationship with them when they were older, but had a harder time connecting with them when they were children. And so Winston would be the parent that Sarah would come to and, mulling over things like, she'd fallen in love and didn't know what to do. He was the parent that she'd turn to, which is a surprising view of Churchill. And I actually walked away from this definitely thinking that Churchill, he really truly valued his wife and daughters, all of his children and his family, and was very much a family man. And that role was incredibly important to him, amidst all the pressures of the office and life that he found himself in. But he really was a very warm and loving dad. And that was a lovely thing to discover. The relationships of Anna and FDR was a little bit different. And I don't know if you want to talk about them each in turn, and then Kathy and Harriman, super interesting too, but very different.
I just, not speaking from a purely historical perspective, but the more I learn about FDR personally, the less I like him. He just comes off much more manipulative. Everyone in his orbit is being used. And then as soon as they're not useful to him, they kind of got put on the outside. And You read that in a lot of different places. The more you read about FDR, to me, he's the exact opposite of Churchill. The more I read about Churchill, warts and all, I like him more. Whereas FDR is the exact opposite. The more you read about him, I just find him to be a much more selfish character once you really dive in deep.
I think that's fair. FDR was a great president and a great person in so many respects. And not to say that Churchill's perfect by any means, but just kind of taking each of them just in the capacity of their role as a father. They're very, very different characters. And I think it just speaks to the complexity of the person who was FDR, who is a lot more nuanced than many people think. Even looking at him as a domestic politician versus in foreign policy, and the skills that served him so well in domestic politics, that kind of touchy-feely style of, working with people and forming coalitions. It didn't work as well in foreign policy, which is also really interesting, even though, of course, the U.S. Won the war, very successful. So there is just a lot more nuance and shading than I think is there at first pass. But especially that role of FDR as father, it's a complicated one. And my heart really broke for his daughter on so many occasions, because she really wanted to have this very close and loving bond with him. Like, she remembered when she was a child, which really changed after his paralysis, where Anna suddenly found herself very much on the outside, sent away to school. His political colleagues kind of surrounded him all the time. And there really wasn't room for her in that world and in his life. And for the rest of her life, she was trying to recapture the sense of being important to him. And while I do think, he loved her and admired her in his own way, he never really told her. And that was something that she was always yearning for. And unfortunately, his needs of his health on the one hand, but also the being president, kind of unfortunately made Anna sometimes a person who was kind of a useful tool in a way, rather than someone that he embraced wholeheartedly as his daughter, which is really complicated, but also really interesting. And I felt like made me grow more as a writer, trying to describe their relationship.
And then we don't want to leave out Kathleen Harriman. When you came to the Harrimans, did you find that they kind of forced themselves into the story because they were there? Did you want to have 3 daughters, right? Because you could probably write this and just focus on Sarah and Anna, but Kathleen kind of pops up and becomes part of the story pretty fast.
Yeah, I don't think that it was a matter of them forcing themselves into the story. They're at the heart and soul of this story, and there's no way to tell it without them. If you think of kind of Churchill and FDR as 2 parts of a Venn diagram, the Harrimans are where that Venn diagram overlaps. Because Harriman is FDR's envoy. He's the ambassador to the Soviet Union. Before that, he'd been FDR's Lend-Lease envoy in London, where he and Kathy became really close friends with the Churchill family, so close that they were celebrating Kathy's 24th birthday on December 7th, 1941, when they all learned the news together about Pearl Harbor. So Harriman and his daughter have a very close emotional friendship with the Churchills, also because Harriman is having an affair with Churchill's daughter-in-law, Pamela, which many people do know about. And so they have this close personal connection. And over time, Harriman comes to see the Soviet Union in a way that's more similar to Churchill than FDR. And by the point of Yalta, Harriman is feeling very frustrated with FDR about kind of assessing the risks to the future that the Soviet Union poses and Stalin's willingness to keep his word. And so you have Harriman kind of as the go-between of these two sides and opposing views, kind of Churchill, the old view, FDR, the new view in a way. And they really are truly at the heart of the story. And I think the fact that Kathleen is there also makes the relationships among the daughters so much more interesting too.
And you touched on this. I love talking about this. Do you think it's Stalin was just that charming that people constantly fell for basically his act, right? Like Churchill, came to Harriman's side where they realized who this guy was, but everybody at first with Stalin was very much taken in by him. And FDR kind of never came around. Was Stalin just that good at playing the game? Or do you think for a lot of people like FDR, they just wanted to be done with war and fighting and everything like that, so they wanted to believe things that, quite frankly, there wasn't enough evidence even then to believe that everything was going to go well?
I think it was a little bit of the willful blindness for the sake of winning the war, defeating the common enemy, wanting to believe in a brighter future. I also think that there was, yes, Stalin was very charming too. He was a great politician, just like Churchill and FDR. He could be extremely generous and gregarious. He took hosting this conference very seriously. It was, culturally very important to the Soviets. They really put on a great show and make their guests feel very welcome. And there's this really interesting observation that Sarah Churchill makes, where she talks about Stalin kind of having these, dancing eyes and this warmth of spirit. But then if you look closer in his eyes, it looks like cold, hard water. And so you can see a little of that duality. And Kathy Harriman also noting that her father's told her that while in a conference negotiation, Stalin would be very gregarious and friendly if things were going well. But then if things weren't going the way he wanted, he'd start doodling on his paper and his doodles would become very menacing. And things like wolves would be coming out of his pen. So he's a complicated character. But I think perhaps most importantly, there was a real lack of knowledge and understanding about the Soviet Union in the United States going back to the Russian Revolution. We hadn't had diplomatic relations with the Soviet Union for almost 20 years between the revolution in 1917 and FDR's presidency. So we had 20 years of lost knowledge about this enormous country that played such an important role during the war. Very few people learned to speak Russian in school. There was one Russian-English language book. Very few people had business contacts there. Averell Harriman is one of the very few people doing business in the Soviet Union at that time. And there were just so few advisors at the State Department who were really well versed in Soviet issues. Chip Bolin and George Kennan, who play a role in the story and go on to become wise men of the Cold War, are two of just a handful. And unfortunately, FDR and his kind of wanting to believe in Stalin, it kind of led him to take his advisors' views less seriously or with less weight than he probably should have. And so it's kind of a combined factor of why that was such a problem at this moment in time.
And not to mention that FDR is, no pun intended, on his last legs. He's very, very sick. It's only a matter of time. I think the most interesting fact that I pulled from the book is when you talked about how FDR never knew his own diagnoses. He went to the doctor did the tests, but he never said, what's wrong with me, what's going on. He just kind of knew it wasn't good, that there probably wasn't a lot of time, but he never actually sat down and said, here's what needs to happen and all of these things. Again, with that kind of that willful blindness that seemed to, on one hand, it probably made him a great president that he could compartmentalize that well, but then it did put pressure on his daughter as well, like a lot of pressure.
Yeah, so Anna arrives home at Christmas 1943 when her husband joins the army and ships out to the Mediterranean. She'd been living in Seattle with her family, but then she moves home while her husband is overseas, and home, of course, is the White House. And while she's there, she realizes that her father is just not well. And people who see him day in, day out can't see the difference. And so she does insist he have this comprehensive medical exam, which reveals he is dying of congestive heart failure, for which there's no cure. And FDR never asks the doctor what's wrong. Eleanor similarly can't bring herself to terms with the idea that he is not going to be around much longer, that something has changed. And so this burden of knowing the full scope of FDR's diagnosis falls to Anna. And so she starts doing everything she can to take pressure off him, kind of becoming his gatekeeper in the White House, delegating tasks to other people. Whether she should have been doing this or not, we can debate, but she was genuinely trying to prolong his life as long as possible. And you can understand, if you're the American president trying to win this war, the sense of your own mortality is not going to help think about the future. And so I can understand FDR not wanting to know, but it's also a really, really difficult position that he then put his daughter in. And, that, like we were talking about earlier, that kind of FDR seeming like he uses people in a way, I think that kind of applied here. And it is complicated and nuanced. And if you were the president dying in that situation, maybe you would have done the same thing. But it is a really horrible burden that Anna has to carry among several others for him.
And probably one of the most complicated aspects of that is that FDR could not drink too much around Soviet Union folk. We joke about it, right, that, how he couldn't drink, but especially in these particular scenarios, it was a big deal if you went to bed too early. There was a lot of protocol. There was a lot of, you're going to insult people if you're not drinking and staying up and smoking cigars. And I mean, that really fell to Anna a lot to try and manage that. It was a full-time job in and of itself.
Absolutely. She's the middleman trying to run interference with the Soviets without offending anyone. FDR's brought his own chefs along because, on the one hand, he just doesn't like the Soviet cuisine as much, and so he wants to eat his own food. But also, it's because his doctor has him on a strict diet. And at these multi course Soviet banquets, you're having caviar and delicacies showcasing the best of cuisine across the Soviet Union, and course after course, and different wines, and of course vodka. And it's just so much. It's so much for any person. And then the toasting, to the point where there's so many toasts that the Westerners start dumping out their vodka in the potted plants and refilling their glasses with water when no one is looking. But especially hard for FDR. And so Anna is the one trying to communicate with the Soviet team, trying to decline their gestures in the most polite way to not offend anyone. But that diplomacy and protocol is so important in any situation involving meetings between foreign leaders, but especially here.
And it's not just if you're a high-level diplomat. I have had lunch at Brighton Beach in New York City, where there was a lot of Russian immigrants. And if you sit down for lunch and they pour you some vodka, you have to have it. It's not an option, really.
True. And I think it's funny, one of the attendees at the dinner that the Soviets hosted, he was a teetotaler, and so he didn't drink, and somehow managed to avoid drinking the vodka, but he kept a tally of how many toasts were offered throughout the evening. And it's just an insane number of toasts that anyone would be under the table. And it's kind of also this test of wills and strength, also kind of who can drink the most. And it's there's light, entertaining aspects of this story amidst a lot of the darkness of the politics that are unfolding at the time. And so it was really enjoyable to kind of dip in and out of the kind of impending sense of tragedy, but also all these moments of levity and humor that also emerge in situations like that.
Now, was the bar tab the most interesting thing you came across in your research, or did you find anything else that really just kind of blew your mind?
Well, the bar tab, that was definitely very interesting. There are also great menus that I was able to draw upon, really interesting artifacts that come out kind of, I guess you have your letters and diaries and photographs and newsreel, but other things like ship logs, kind of detailing what movies were watched on the ship on the way over. That stuff is fun to see. But on the more serious side, I'd say the thing that most surprised me throughout my research was that the Holocaust never came up during the discussions at Yalta. Of all the topics up for debate, the Holocaust and concerns about the plight of the Jews at the end of the war was never, ever discussed. And the only time that the Jews were mentioned was in this really awful and distasteful anecdote that FDR told, which was supposed to be a story about kind of coming together and overcoming differences, in a story that he was telling about attending a dinner with the Ku Klux Klan, which is just so bizarre and really unsettling to read in today's context. And he kind of brings up the Jewish community in that story, which is really odd. And that is the only time throughout the conference that the Jewish people come up, despite the fact that we know that they knew then, if not the full extent, at least the beginnings of the extent of the Holocaust.
Now, one of the things that I like to ask authors, right, is History Nerds United started it to get people who aren't necessarily into history really into it, right? Now, so I think we've already talked about a lot of fantastic anecdotes, but if somebody said, why should I care about this book? I like to read a thriller or something like that. How would you sell this to them in just a couple of sentences that this is something that they should take a chance on?
Well, the best stories come right out of history. You don't have to make it up. It's all true. It's right there. You've got spies running amok at Yalta. Alger Hiss, who is brought along as a State Department advisor. He had been spying for the Soviets for years, and he's right there in the mix. You have bugging operations that the Soviets are running, where they put bugs not only in the private bedrooms of the attendees, but also out in the garden, where the Westerners think that they can speak frankly. But the Soviets have actually thought two steps ahead, and they specifically cleared certain paths in the garden for FDR to access in his wheelchair to make it more likely he'll use those. And then they bugged those. It's kind of these themes of everything stays the same. You see still today with Russia and a lot of the things that we're continually surprised by. We don't need to be surprised by because we've seen it happen before. The curse of geography, where the Crimea is such an important part of the story, the physical space in which they're having this conference, that is front and center in the news again today. So you see history repeating once again. But I think more than anything, for people who, maybe they feel like history is just names and dates and it's not their thing, the story here is, again, the story about relationships between fathers and daughters And it makes you realize that history is so much more personal. Where even if you don't know what it's like to negotiate with Stalin, you do know what it's like to be part of a family, and you can't separate that out from the facts that you learn in history class. It's all intertwined, and those relationships are always at the heart of what's happening. And so it's every bit as much Downton Abbey as it is, diplomatic negotiations. So that's my pitch for why you should read history, especially with history like this.
Speaking of you as a story, you look into authors right before I talk to anybody, just kind of look at what other people want to ask you and things like that. And a lot of times with history books, I do searches and it's about the history. It's about that. What I see is this is your first book. It's doing amazing by really any standard you can possibly come up with. And what I've noticed is that you're becoming part of the story too, right? Like it's not just, this is your book, this is what it's about. Your name starts coming up. It's your family, all of those types of things. Are you noticing that as you're like going through this process? I don't want to call it a brand or anything like that, but are you noticing that it's just not about the book? Like people are also getting interested in you, and how does that feel?
Well, I think first and foremost, it is primarily about the book. And if people are curious about me and why I was interested in it, I'm very flattered. And that's very nice of them to inquire. I think perhaps some element of it is a bit of an anomaly. Often you have older people, historians who've been in the business for a really long time writing about these types of events. And I think the idea that, I started writing this book when I was 27, which is the same age that Kathy Harriman was at Yalta. I published it right before I turned 30, which was the age that Sarah Churchill was. I think this, not that someone older couldn't have written the story, but it stood out to me because of just certain things about being in the same phase of my life as these characters were. I think that's important. But also family is really, really important to me. I'm really close to my family. And so I think that the idea that I would write about something involving family, that makes sense to me. And yeah, I think also just kind of as you pointed out, you're writing this book during law school. It's probably not something that most historians do. I think it's a bit of it's a little unusual. That's kind of fun for some people to learn about. But I don't know. It genuinely, the story, it feels like it found me, and I will always be grateful that whatever stars aligned where these daughters, from the Yalta conference chose me to tell their story. I will always be so grateful for that, and I hope that I've done them justice.
Writing your first book before 30, you made me feel very lazy again, but we're going to pass. We're going to keep going. We're going to move right through it. Now, I did read something. Is it possible that this might become a movie? How close are we? Yes,
things are happening. I can't say too much about it. I think, one of the things that I'm hoping for COVID to get under control is so things can happen more quickly. I think that's shared for everybody in every walk of life, that business happens faster when COVID doesn't shut things down. So all I will say for now is stay tuned. I'm very excited.
I do have 3 quick follow-up questions. Can I be in it? Can I be Stalin? And why not?
Well, I'm just hoping that they'll let me be, starving, sad Russian peasant on the side of the road, number 4. So, if I get that, then we can talk about Stalin.
I think I can at least pull off the mustache. I really think I can. If you gave me time, I could do it.
You can definitely do the mustache, but I don't know how tall you are because you're sitting down right now, but Stalin was only about 5'5", 5'6". So if you're much taller than that, you might have a height issue.
I'll figure out how to get shorter for a movie. I'll figure out how to Tom Cruise it. So you apparently do a billion different things, but I do have 2 questions. One that I always ask every author, but there's going to be one right before this. So you were born in New York, but you're a Chicagoan, basically, just right outside of Chicago. Mm-hmm. Is it a requirement that you have to watch all John Hughes movies and the show Shameless? Is that a requirement?
Well, I've never seen the show Shameless. However, John Hughes, huge fan. I grew up in the town where they filmed Home Alone and Ferris Bueller's Day Off. Literally, I am from the Home Alone town. So the John Hughes movies are near and dear to my heart. A, because they're amazing movies, brilliant writing. I think they just capture so much of what it is to be, a teenager, and kind of give them credit for more than a lot of people often do. But the thing that I love the most about the John Hughes movies is that for the rest of my life, that I will always have a time capsule of what it was like to grow up in my town in the 1990s, because my grocery store and my drugstore and the ice rink where we all would go out and skate which the fire department, they'd freeze the park over and, Kevin goes and slides across it. Those are all things that are just so much a part of my childhood. And someday, when I have kids, I'll be able to show them that movie and say, this is what it was like for me to grow up. So I'm so happy that John Hughes made those movies there, and I will just treasure them forever.
Now, you are a Yankees fan.
I am.
You told me before we started, you're probably going to have to explain that based upon what we just talked about. How does that happen?
Oh, I was born in New York. So in the imprinting phase of childhood, clearly, the right team allegiance was imprinted upon my brain. My dad was a big Yankees fan, and we loved baseball. So we watched a lot of baseball growing up. And then, in Chicago, I just never really understood the appeal of the Cubs. Yes, they've won this World Series since I was a little kid, but I just felt like I didn't understand the appeal of constantly losing, and that this moniker of the lovable losers, it just didn't make sense to me. Maybe because I'd been trained to be a Yankees fan. I wrote one of my junior high school English papers. We had to write an essay defining a word, and I had to write about the word pride. And I wrote my essay defining the word pride based on how Cubs fans don't have any. So you can really see the depths of my feelings on this. I probably shouldn't say that because now I've just dissuaded any Cubs fan from ever buying any book.
Oh, yeah, you're getting hate mail. You are 100% getting hate mail. That's okay.
But, all I can say is that I love baseball. I love sports. And so, I'm happy to get into it with anybody. And sometimes the best friendships come out of a deep-seated hatred of opposing teams. So it's always fun.
And you really love baseball. You played on a boys' team, right? Because you really, really wanted to play baseball, right?
It's not so much that. So I'd go out in the backyard, at night with my brother and my dad, and we'd play catch and wiffle ball. And my dad went to sign up my brother for baseball, and he just signed me up as well, kind of not thinking that girls play softball instead. He's just like, oh, you like to play baseball in the backyard? We'll sign you up too. And it just didn't really occur to me that other girls wouldn't be playing. And so I got out there. I was a really girly little girl. I still am. I had, bows in my braids in third grade. I go out and I end up really loving pitching. And, pitching in baseball is different from pitching in softball. And so I decided to stick with it. I ended up being able to throw a knuckleball. So that was why I stuck with baseball, because I love to pitch.
Do you think that put you on the road to Harvard? Like just that started that where you're just going to do what you want and power through and not let anything stop you?
I think it's more that I was just a huge nerd from an early age, and I just loved school, loved to learn, always reading. So yeah, I'm really so happy that I had the chance to go to Harvard and to be back now for law school. It's a great place to learn and to be surrounded by history where it's there at every turn. And, for someone who loves history, there's no better environment to be in somewhere like Harvard or Cambridge in the UK. And it's been really special to be able to receive my education there.
All right, here it is. This is what I always close out with, the last question. You're super smart. You're doing a billion different things, but everybody has their guilty pleasure watching TV. Will you admit the trash TV shows that you watch? You got to name them specifically, and you got to own up to it.
Trash TV shows that I watch. Ooh. God, now you're putting me on the spot, and I really have to think about this.
Yep. I've been setting you up from the beginning that it was all going to be about history and stuff, and then boom, talk about The Real Housewives.
I don't watch The Real Housewives. I watched one season of The Bachelorette with my sister after she had scoliosis surgery. So I don't know if that counts because it was a special circumstance. What do I watch? I mean, I love The Office. I love The Office. Huge fan of The Office.
Oh, that's just classic. That's not trash. That's just classic.
Not trash. Okay. I'm really excited to watch Impeachment. I haven't seen that yet, so I don't know if that counts either.
No, too close to history.
Oh, no, I've got one. I have one. Not on anymore, or at least not in the incarnation in which I loved it. Project Runway. That's my show.
There we go. We knew there was something there.
I love Project Runway.
Perfect. Catherine Grace Katz, thank you so much for coming on here. Really appreciate it.
Thank you so much for having me. It's been so fun to chat with you.
And that's it for this episode. Catherine, thank you so much. It was a great conversation. I thoroughly enjoyed it from beginning to end. Everyone, please like us, follow us everywhere you can find us, social media, Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, all of those places. Head to wherever you find the podcast. Please rate us 5 stars if you don't mind. Leave a comment. Leave comments everywhere. We want to hear from you. We really appreciate all the encouragement. We've heard a lot of things from you. We have a lot of surprises coming out over the next few months. Keep an eye out, nerds. Talk to you later.